Discipline is the ability to regulate one's behavior in accordance to chosen principles, goals, or standards in the absence of motivation or external pressure. And I want to start from this definition because it immediately dismantles one of the most damaging myths people carry about self-improvement, which is the idea that discipline is something you either have or do not have, something connected to personality, temperament, or some innate mental strength that only a few people are born with. Well, this definition makes something very clear. Discipline is not an emotional state, it is not a burst of energy, and it is not the result of feeling inspired or aligned with what you are about to do. Discipline exists precisely in the moments where motivation is absent, where the mind resists, and where comfort pulls you in the opposite direction, and yet behavior still follows a pre-chosen standard. If motivation is present, discipline is not required. If external pressure is present, discipline is not required. Discipline only appears when you are alone with your own resistance and still decide to act. Most people never truly train discipline because they unknowingly outsource it. They rely on deadlines, social pressure, excitement, fear of judgment, or temporary motivation to move forward. And while these forces can produce short-term action, they never build the intentional capacity to regulate behavior when none of those forces are available. The moment the pressure disappears, the behavior collapses, and this creates a cycle where people constantly feel broken, inconsistent, or undisciplined, when in reality they have simply never trained the one condition where discipline actually grows. This is why I refer to discipline as an art. Not because it's beautiful or expressive, but because it requires intentional structure, patience, and repetition under imperfect conditions. You are shaping your own behavior against resistance, just like an artist shapes material that does not naturally want to take form. So the first step to mastering this art is understanding that discipline cannot operate in ambiguity. The nervous system does not regulate behavior around vague intentions like I should work harder or I want to be more consistent. Those statements carry no operational weight. Discipline requires rules that are concrete enough to be obeyed without negotiation, like a time, a duration, a condition, or a standard. When something is unclear, the mind fills the gap with comfort. When something is clear, the body can act with precision. This is why people who claim to lack discipline often live inside constant negotiation with themselves. They wake up deciding how they feel about training. They sit down deciding whether they are in the right mindset to work. They postpone decisions until later in the day, hoping motivation will appear, not realizing that every negotiation weakens their authority over their own behavior. And this is a very important point. So, discipline begins when decisions are made in advance and executed regardless of internal debate. Once a rule exists, the real training starts, and this is where most people misunderstand the process. They believe the goal is to eliminate resistance, to eventually reach a point where acting in alignment with their own standards feels natural, easy, or enjoyable. But in reality, resistance never actually disappears. What changes is your relationship to it. Disciplined individuals do not feel less resistance, they just stop treating it as a deal breaker. So the core mechanism here is acting before emotion. Instead of waiting to feel ready, you move and allow your emotional state to adapt afterward. This feels counterintuitive because we are taught that emotions should guide action, that forcing ourselves is unhealthy, that alignment must precede effort. Yet every meaningful skill humans develop follows the opposite pattern. Action comes first, adaptation follows, and discipline is no different. Now, each time you act despite resistance, something subtle but very powerful happens. You teach your nervous system that discomfort is survivable, that hesitation does not need to be obeyed, and that your chosen standards carry authority even when internal conditions are unfavorable. Over time, resistance loses its emotional charge, not because it disappears, but because it stops being interpreted as a danger. This is also where consistency becomes more important than intensity, a point that sounds simple but is rarely understood deeply. Discipline is not often forged in moments of extreme effort or emotional breakthroughs. It is most of the time built in repetition, in showing up when nothing feels significant, like when progress is invisible and when the mind tells you that skipping today will not matter. Those moments are the training ground because they mirror the conditions of real life far more accurately than rare moments of motivation. When behavior becomes predictable, the question of whether you feel like acting fades into the background. Discipline is no longer experienced as a force, but rather as a default setting of your mentality. This means that you don't take actions because they feel good, but rather because it's now normal to do them. Discomfort also takes on a different meaning through this process. For most people, discomfort is interpreted as a signal that something is wrong, that they should stop, rest, rethink, or escape. In the context of discipline, though, discomfort is reinterpreted as a confirmation that you are operating in the exact zone where growth occurs. The presence of resistance is not a failure of discipline, it is the evidence that discipline is being exercised. This shift is crucial because mastery is not about making life easier or more comfortable. It is about making your standards heavier than your impulses. When that happens, moods lose their controlling power. Motivation becomes a bonus rather than a requirement, and external pressure becomes irrelevant because regulation comes from within. At its deepest level, discipline is an act of self-respect. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, you reinforce trust in your own word. But every time you break one, you weaken that trust. Over time, this compounds, and the quality of your inner dialogue changes. You stop arguing with yourself, you stop justifying, you stop explaining, and your standards simply execute. Mastery of discipline is reached when your principles dictate your behavior more reliably than your feelings, when action no longer depends on how the moment feels, and when obedience to your own rules becomes part of your identity rather than an effort you need to summon. That was the art of discipline, when chosen principles quietly govern your own behavior even as motivation fades and resistance remains present. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to subscribe. I will catch you in the next one.